What is the most successful lie in history? That diamonds are valuable. Made one family really rich though. Gotta love how many people try to defend their artificially inflated value. Just shows how well the lie continues to work. My father works for a science department of a major Ivy League school. One project they were working on required a large amount of high-purity diamond dust, so he literally called up Erik de Beers, explained who he was, and asked about purchasing 1 kilogram of pure diamond. The sales rep puts him on hold for a few minutes, then comes back and says, "We have a 1 kilogram diamond of that purity in stock, but we can't give it to you whole. We'd have to process it into dust first." After he picked his jaw up off the floor, my father thanked them and placed the order. For context, 1 kilogram is 5,000 carats. Frank Abagnale Jr.B., the inspiration for Catch Me If You Can, apparently wasn't as big of a con man that the movie leads you to believe. He conned people into thinking he was a bigger con man than he actually was. My wife and I are watching the TV show Scorpion. The intro says it's based on a real person who was a super genius with a 197 IQ. Come to find out that the real Walter O'Brien is just some guy who ended up producing this bit of self-insert fantasy, and his claim to having a 197 IQ was based on an unverified self-reported story about an IQ test he took as a child. The guy's name and the 197 IQ part are the only aspect of the show that are even loosely based on reality. Everything else is 100% pure masturbatory fantasy. Show's still alright though. We are using mass surveillance to help catch terrorists. Not that I'm contradicting you, but this lie was sold with the fact that the things they found over there are indeed on a list of weapons of mass destruction, or illegal war tools, mortar shells with mustard gas stuff in them, all kinds of essentially useless that was in crates and hidden in the ground and such. It wasn't the nukes or high-octane mother or missiles or anything we were led to believe, but I seen some links to documents defending that lie, and legally there was no lie. There were tons of found, but we all know bending the truth is also lying. I just feel like if more people know that we altered what as WMD is on paper, so that we could say we were there for WMDs, then more people will understand how our government and many others work. Lies and PR. This was supposed to be replying to the guy under your comment. I'm leaving it up. I before E except after C. Unless your foreign neighbor Keith offers you 8 counterfeit sleighs from feisty caffeinated weightlifters. Weird. Honestly, English is such a weird mutant language that trying to apply any sort of rules to it is useless. It's also the only major word language without government institutions to maintain it, probably because there are so many varieties. And some rules are made up, like the one about prepositions at the end of a sentence or splitting infinitives. Trojan horse comes to mind. There's actually not much archaeological evidence of there having been a Greek versus Trojan war at all. We know that there was a city called Troy in modern-day Turkey, but there definitely doesn't appear to be evidence that would suggest anything like a 10-year siege as described in the Iliad. Ancient Greek history is kind of interesting because there's so much mythology and legend sprinkled through it that you know are fictional. But a lot of the events do have a nugget of truth too. But I think a lot of people assume more of it is based in reality than it actually is. In the 90s, kids spread the rumor that Marilyn Manson had a rib removed so he could his own. We spread this rumor across the entire country without the use of cell phones or the internet. I would love to know who patient zero is for that rumor. It spread to my little rural hometown in Australia in 1998. Grade 5 me didn't even know who Marilyn Manson was, but I was just amazed that anyone would alter their anatomy just to their own, particularly at that age when you think your DCAC is only for pissing out of. That lobbying isn't just bribery with extra steps. In theory, and when done correctly, lobbying is a very important thing. Just think about how clueless, stupid, and removed from reality politicians on average are. And even the best politicians can't know all the important information about all the fields they write laws about. So getting information from the respective fields is important. How it's done in the US is closer to a failed state than a correct way though. One that we'll never know was a lie. My father is a fan of Herman Melville and the stories he told of adventures sailing the trade routes across the Pacific Ocean. He was inspired after reading Typee to write another story set in the Marquesas and began researching events that happened there. While digging through correspondences and cross-referencing shipping manifests, he discovered that the published history of one John Maury, who was somewhat famous in his day for being stranded on the island for 2 years, had made up most of his adventures, and had only been on Nuku Hiva for a few months. I suspect there are a great many stories like this, lies that were so successful they were published as fact. When the Allies tricked Germany into thinking D-Day was happening at other locations which weakened their defenses at the primary landing points, General Rommel called it because he was a tactical genius, but Hitler was suspecting that he was trying to overthrow him or was in with the group on the assassination attempts against him and didn't trust him by that point in the war. The best thing for the Americans was Hitler's growing paranoia as the war went on. If the Germans had properly defended Normandy like Rommel wanted, we might never have gotten the foothold into win that do. It's not you, it's me. While that has become a cliché, there is some wisdom in the belief that this relationship simply will not work out. No human is infallible, and we are capable of changing and falling out of love. To tell one's partner before looking for another in the interest simply of moving on to what they believe is a better situation for both parties is wise. What is worse is to allow a gap in communication to create a distance so great the couple cannot envision what they once were and how everything has changed. Isn't always that clean or innocent, but if done gently, those words can have a profoundly positive impact on the lives of folks just trying to move on. That fat is harmful to your diet. That was just false information, and by trying to replace fats with sugar, obesity became an epidemic. McDonald's used to fry their French fries in beef tallow, which was the traditional and authentic French fry method in Europe. However, a cardiologist made it his personal vendetta to sue McDonald's for causing heart disease by frying with beef tallow. The case dragged for years and ultimately, McDonald's switched to a vegetable oil. The result was an inferior taste and texture and has been found to be a less healthy, more carcinogenic fry. The beef tallow was totally fine and made the fry much tastier. McDonald's gained profits as the new vegetable oil was much cheaper, so it has stayed that way. That black people and watermelon are racist stereotypes. The truth is that when the slaves were freed, they grew and sold watermelon as a way to earn money to feed, clothe, and house themselves. The watermelon was actually a symbol of freedom and self-reliance for newly freed slaves. What happened was that the former slave owners saw this and started a propaganda campaign to turn white people away from buying N-food, as they called it. It's probably one of the earliest examples of the press manipulating the truth for its owners. This is where the big lips and eating like animals pictures came from. When black people started selling chickens, the same thing happened. Only this time it came in movie form. The black people and fired chicken thing started in Birth of a Nation, the racist as KKK movie. What should be symbols of freedom and self-reliance to a people struggling after centenaries of slavery were twisted into symbols of shame. So much so that 100 years later they're both still seen with negative connections. That getting yourself in crazy debt at 18 years old to go to college is the only path to success in life. This lie was explicitly developed to pad the derivatives market. Take something that was available to Americans, make it indispensable to any future paying job, even secretaries or bank tellers, jack the price up from $2,000 to $50,000, create a cycle of debt compounded with high interest, and voila, you've just underwritten empty fiat currency that was delinked from the gold standard. Bonus is that it ensures people enter the workforce ASAP, as this is the only source of actual value produced by the US, as the Fed can just print money willy-nilly and be able to make bets and buy and sell these debts as securities. Criminal. It's why every counselor under the sun in the 2000s was encouraging kids to just take on the debt, as education is priceless. Fat is bad for you, sugar is okay. Have 11 servings of bread per day. I think the bread thing is due to fiber, but store-bought bread has almost no fiber, thus 11 servings are needed. Something like only 5% of Americans get the recommended daily amount of fiber. It only works if you're eating real bread, not the store-bought HSES, made of spelt, emmer, or einkorn flour, which are more nutrient and fiber-rich than white flour. Good luck eating 11 servings of it. If it's good bread, you'll get full pretty quickly eating it. The good news is that high-fiber bread means you don't have to eat as much to get your daily fiber. I started making enriched spelt bread, and it's now a weekly thing. I eat a couple 4-inch diameter buns for breakfast and I've been losing weight steadily. Kinda requires a stand mixer, but making bread at home will save you quite a bit, so I think it's worth it. Cigarettes don't cause cancer. Successful because of the money they made off that lie. I read this wrong and thought you meant the lie was that they do cause cancer, and I was like, what the? Talk to my grandpa who smoked his whole life. Oh wait, you can't, he died of lung cancer. Glad I just read this wrong. At least this is common knowledge now for people, and it does seem like a lot fewer adults smoke cigarettes. The government's obfuscation of the drug war to villainize opioid dependence. Piggybacking off this to add everything about the crack boom. For example, crack babies was simply a complete lie. There is no data that supports the concept of crack babies. It was part of how the government justified seizing custody of black children. Only one I can think of is when Hitler successfully convinced all of Germany that the Jews were the problem. It might be interesting to consider this a case of cherry picking, which I feel is the bigger problem. In other words, the reason anti-Semitism developed so much was because people were cherry picking their hatred. No question, there were insane lies in there, elders of Zion, babying, etc., but at the same time, there was indeed a sense of national identity that Jews had that was simply other than the country in which they resided. For example, there were cases of financial hardship at the hands of Jews and non-Jews, of course. There were many financial dealings by Jews, and this was connected with general income disparity and the Great Depression, etc. The problem is that cherry picking can go much further than simple lying. And referring to cherry picking as lying has the danger of falling flat, absent clear-cut lies. This is why Trump and his ilk are holding on for so long, why the new psychos of the right are flourishing in Congress. It's not that they lie, it's that they cherry-pick their truth. Everyone is in the truth, in a manner of speaking. But that truth can be riddled with bull and isn't just a matter of truth versus lies. Catherine the Great died having with a horse. She didn't, and this was known at the time. But a number of her contemporaries, mostly British and French leaders, who respected neither Russia nor female rulers, started the rumor in order to sully her legacy. And since the first thing that comes to a lot of people's minds when they think of Catherine the Great is the horsing story, the lie worked. I am hijacking this comment to add an anecdote about a former French president, Félix IV. It looks like the story may have been exaggerated, but it still is funny enough to share it. Félix IV was president during the French Third Republic in the late 19th century. He is the only French president to die in the president's official palace, and at the time of his death, he was alone in a room with his mistress, Marguerite Steinhall. A close collaborator, his chief of cabinet, heard cries from the room, entered and discovered him lying on a couch with his mistress trying to find her clothes to cover herself. The next day, all the press told that story, with some funny phrases, the best often attributed to Clemenceau, a famous French politician, probably being "Il voulut tuer César, il fut mort Pompey," or in English, he wanted to be Caesar, he died Pompey, which does not look funny in English. In French, tree pomp or say faire pomper can be translated as getting a blowjob, so you can get the joke now. Several years later, it was said that he was already weak this morning, that he had harsh meetings during the day, one about the Dreyfus affair. He may have died with his family and doctor, and this story could be wrong. We may never know. Still, I wanted to share it there. Also, I never heard that story about Catherine the Great. That politicians are genuinely going to help you once they're elected. As a gun enthusiast, I've completely lost faith in getting any of my rights back through politicians, especially after that last Republican majority. Republican politicians don't actually give a single about gun rights. From 2016 to 2018, we got the President, House, and Senate all red at the same time. After all their pro-2A talk, we finally got them a once-in-a-lifetime blank check to actually get some pro-gun legislation through for once. And what was done with it? Absolutely nothing. It was completely wasted. No Hearing Protection Act, no reciprocity, no SBR deregulation, nothing. They make a big show out of trying to push through pro-gun bills when they know the Democrats control a branch to block them, but when they actually have an opportunity to really get them done, they don't even try. Actions speak louder than words, and as far as gun rights go, the GOP is nothing but useless fake allies who deserve nothing but contempt. Milk doesn't increase bone strength. Carrots don't improve eyesight. That's a WW to myth. Both of those are actually true, but only in the sense of them being good sources of vitamins and minerals, thus decreasing the likelihood of becoming deficient in calcium, protein, vit. A, which before the industrial agricultural revolution was more likely to happen to people. If you are deficient, eating carrots will be a good source for getting your vitamin back up again, and drinking milk will provide calcium and protein so that your body doesn't have to resort to bone resorption to maintain adequate levels of calcium in the blood. Recycling plastic makes a difference. Newsflash, the term carbon footprint was created by BP, one of the biggest oil companies in the world, with the help of one of the biggest marketing companies in the world to shift the focus from industry to individual responsibility. To make clear how big of a problem plastic is, we just need to take a look at the several huge plastic islands in our oceans, some bigger than whole countries. We know exactly where they are, yet we can't get rid of them, cause we have no idea what to do with that much plastic waste. At the same time, industry produces more and more of it. Meanwhile, I've seen several food packages I still know from my childhood that always were cardboard and now are plastic, also loads of double and even triple wrapped goods and ever so on, and we as individuals barely can have any influence, for example, through not buying those products, cause nearly all companies do it. They make you think you as an individual can have an impact when you use a paper straw and a wooden fork for your fries. They print nature-loving slogans on paper bags and try to keep their product wrappings in a slightly brownish color to make you think it's better for the environment, and then they keep going on with the same bull they've done for decades. As long as it's cheap, they don't care about what it does, and the politics do about it, and instead give us instructions about we should change our life to help the environment, and from time to time they stand next to someone who plants a tree on their behalf to get photos for the newspaper and show how much they care for nature. This got longer than I expected. Seemingly something had to get out. Laws are designed to ensure that everyone is treated fairly and equally. Laws, as an idea, are older than not only humanity but at least primates. Laws are not meant to make us equal or prevent tyranny. Laws are there to establish some sort of order. Without modern laws, world would be chaos and we would be just bunch of animals. Without those ancient unwritten rules, we would be at the level of insects. That is a very scary concept, as there is nothing more horrific than the world through the eyes of a worm. Bush claiming that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. This one kinda drives me nuts. The whole argument about invading Iraq revolved around whether or not Iraq had an active nuclear weapons program, hence Condi's line about smoking guns and mushroom clouds. Now, Iraq didn't have a nuclear weapons program, but there were tons of bolters willing to make up to tell the CIA to make it seem like they did. The CIA knew this was nonsense and told the White House as much. The White House didn't want to hear it, so they embraced the bull, even going so far as to set up their own intelligence shop in the Pentagon to give them the kind of intel assessments they wanted. Now, this whole time, the intelligence community assessed that Saddam probably had some chemical weapons squirreled away somewhere in case of emergencies. That turned out not to be the case, but it was a pretty reasonable thing to think. Even countries that opposed the invasion largely agreed with that assessment. But importantly, the intelligence community's mistaken assessment that there might be some sarin in a bunker somewhere isn't what led to the invasion. What led to the invasion was a pile of bull from the White House about nuclear weapons. Oh, and connections to Al-Qaeda. The White House made up a bunch of nonsense about connections between Saddam and bin Laden, too. Some tech for background. Have you ever heard of a radar detector? How about a radar detector, which the police use to see if you have a detector? Ever wonder how they work? I mean, a radar detector is a receiver. How could the police possibly know you have one? Until recently, practically every radio used a concept called superheterodyne. Basically, there's a tiny radio transmitter in your receiver. That signal is mixed with the one from the antenna, and the result is what your receiver tunes to. It's one of the most important inventions of the 20th century, and you most likely never heard of it. Poor Ed, all he got for his work was jumping out a window to his death. The problem is that sometimes the tiny transmitter is poorly shielded and some of it leaks back out the antenna. If you know what that intermediate frequency is, you can listen for it. The escort radar detectors, which were super popular in the 80s, leaked like a sieve. Presto, radar detectors. Takeaway: if you know what you're looking for, you can actually detect someone else's radio receiver. The setup: in 1942, RAF planes began using VHF radar to look for German submarines leaving port in France at night. All of a sudden, they were getting sunk en masse. The Germans were familiar with other British radars working around this frequency and were able to find the new radar's frequency around August. They built a receiver, METOX, which was tuned to this frequency. When a plane using this radar was anywhere in the area, METOX would play a sound into the radio operator's headphones. By October, most of the fleet had it, and the RAF pilots were returning with stories about how the U-boats would always dive as soon as they turned toward them to attack. But the RAF had prepared for this moment. They knew it was only a matter of time before the Germans found the frequency. Earlier, 2 grad students had come up with a new device called the magnetron that produced very strong radio signals from a device the size of a bread box. And the signal was really short, about 10 centimeters, whereas their older radars were 150. So METOX was completely incapable of hearing it. It was tuned way too far from the frequency of the new signal. They rushed the new system into production, and the first sets started arriving just in time for the U-boat campaign to start up again in spring when the weather got better. By March, it was clear to the Germans something was up. Their boats were getting sunk en masse again, and the ones that escaped attack said there was no warning on their detectors. They tried everything to detect the new signal, but they just couldn't find it. This was because they were missing one extremely important bit of electronics, the crystal detector, and simply couldn't hear the signals no matter how hard they tried. And now, the lie knowing something was up, U-boats were on high alert all the time. One got lucky and shot down its attacker and captured the crew. During interrogation, they asked why they could no longer detect the radar. The pilot told them they no longer used radar. Instead, he claimed, they had a receiver for METOX, and under perfect conditions they could pick it up 90 miles away. They only turned on the radar at the last minute for range measurements, so they knew when to drop the depth charges. By that time, the U-boat was too busy exploding to notice. The Germans didn't believe him, but it was technically possible. One can indeed make a receiver to detect your receiver, and METOX was known to be leaky, as it was deliberately built quick and cheap from a pre-war French radio set. So they built their own METOX receiver in the lab, and sure enough, they could detect it. So then they put it on a plane and detected one of their boats 60 miles away. Utter panic. Orders were sent out to all boats, turn off METOX. And so not only did the RAF get to keep using their fancy new magnetron radar without the Germans even trying to detect it, but then they turned off their perfectly good METOX detectors, and all the RAF planes with the older radar suddenly started working again too. And that is the greatest lie ever. By the end of June, the U-boat fleet was on the bottom of the ocean. This was not due entirely to this trick. There were a number of things that all arrived at almost the same time that did it. It was the combination of the new radars, Huff Duff, larger numbers of frigates dedicated to the task, and the lack of any detectors on the U-boats that made even the old radars work again all arrived within 2 months. And that was that. The Germans finally figured it out sometime around November. Apparently, the pilot made the whole thing up on his own. This little white lie helped open the Atlantic to the convoys of 1943 that led to the end of Italy's involvement and ultimately D-Day.